Welcome back to the Global Business Report on Rise News. According to the African Development Bank, Africa's real GDP should expand by 4.1% in 2022, a significant decrease on the near 7% growth rate. Well, actually, a rebound from what was seen in 2020. Now, of course, let's take a look at some of those figures as we take a look at the numbers from the African Development Bank. Now, according to the AFDB's Outlook report, this is what the projection is based on. The continent's strong economic prospects are jeopardized by ongoing COVID-19 pandemic, the Russia or Ukraine conflict, and of course, low vaccination rates. There's the numbers right there. So contraction on GDP for 1.6% 2020. Real GDP grows 6.7% 2021. 4.1% is what we're seeing for 2022. Joining us to discuss further, Professor Kevin Urama, who's the acting chief economist at the African Development Bank. Good afternoon to you, sir. He joins us live from Abidjan. Thank you so much for joining us. Can you talk us through the growth trajectory of the African continent from 2020 through to 2022?
Yeah, thank you very much for having me. As you already have said, like in other regions, African countries saw a contraction in GDP in 2020. We saw a 1.6% contraction in 2020, but the countries have, the growth in the countries have been very resilient. So we've seen a resurgence, a rebound in the growth to 6.9% in 2021. But we're expecting to see a 4.1%, a deceleration to 4.1% in 2022 and 2023 because of other exogenous factors and some other internal factors that we still need to deal with. Of course, the geopolitical tensions, including the Russia-Ukraine war, being one of the major ones. So we've seen huge rises in inflation, currently about 13% in Africa, but we expect that it might go up to 13.5% in 2022 if the Russia-Ukraine war continues. And we see also that debt remains a major challenge on the continent with a rising debt to GDP ratio. We expect it will stabilize around 70% of GDP in 2022 and 2023, which is still above the pre-pandemic levels. So we still see that issue about debt distress being a major risk for the continent. Of course, there are several factors that have led us to where we are now, and I'll be happy to discuss some of those factors going forward in the interview.
All right.
But also,
yes, go right ahead. Continue, please.
Okay. Now, the major factor a point to mention here is that the growth has been heterogeneous across the regions and also across economic groupings of the regions, with Northern Africa seeing the highest rebound in growth of about 11.7% in 2022, and Southern Africa following suit, even though South Africa saw the highest impact from COVID, having had a contraction of 6% in 2020, we're seeing a healthy growth of about 4.4% in that region in this year. But both regions are going to see some deceleration because of these exogenous factors I've talked about, the Russia-Ukraine war, inflation, but also as the effects of fiscal stimulus that were implemented by those countries to help cushion the effect of COVID-19 starts to wait as recovery starts to happen. So it's normally expected that happens. But the other regions, Western Africa, Eastern Africa, and Central Africa, have all gone back to positive growth and is expected to remain stable above 4.4% or 4.5%, depending on which region you are looking at, in 2022 and 2023. Because of commodity price increases, of course, West Africa is driven by Nigeria. The oil price increases has seen a rebound in Nigeria's growth. And then for other regions, we see, especially in East Africa, good to point out, they had very good policies for reacting to COVID, and they didn't see a contraction. Their growth was about 1.5% during that period of COVID. So overall, the Africa's economy has been very resilient, and we really need to appreciate our leaders for the effort that's been made to try and keep the trajectory going forward despite the global headwinds that we have been receiving.
All right. And speaking of headwinds, if you were to rank them, I mean, how would you rank the threats that are being faced by the continent? which one's worse? Is it the war? Is it and we can put those threats up for our viewers. Is it the war? Is it COVID? Is it low vaccination rates? Is it sovereign debt levels? How would you rank these threats?
Yeah, if you ask me for threats that's facing African countries by levels of priority, I would say that in the short term, dealing with the debt issue is a major challenge for us. And why I rank it as a major challenge is that it's combined with the fact that some of the drivers of debt vulnerability in Africa are not actually within our control, within some of the African countries' control. Like we see, for example, after the COVID fiscal stimulus, we saw like a whooping 17 trillion US dollars that were injected into the economies in fiscal measures across the world to address COVID. The natural thing that happens is that countries will try to shrink their balance sheet. So we're seeing fiscal consolidation, and we're also seeing tightening of monetary policy. And especially when that happens in the US. And then we're seeing appreciation of the dollar. And then many African countries have dollar denominated debt. So their debt vulnerability is increasing for no fault of theirs because they haven't borrowed more, but just the cost of repayment is increasing. And if I consider the fact that Africa is already spending about 18% of its gross revenues, domestic revenues in Africa, to address the debt challenge, when that is increasing, it becomes another major challenge because the ripple effects on the fiscal capacity of countries could be multifarious. So that's one aspect. And the way to address this is also available. Given what we've seen in COVID, the world has the tools and the resources to be able to address some of these challenges when there is a political will to do that. I just told you 17 trillion were basically put into the economy in order to try and address the impacts of COVID. And now we've seen the SDRs of the IMF, equivalent of 650 billion US dollars, to help countries cushion the impacts on their fiscal space. And out of that, Africa received 33.2 billion US dollars. So what I'm saying here is that, yes, debt is a challenge, but there are tools that can help Africa to address it. First is boosting domestic revenue. Africa's debt to GDP ratio is high because the revenue, the GDP growth is not at the level where it should be. So the best way to really get out of the debt challenge is to find ways of diversifying the economy, boosting domestic revenue mobilization, both tax revenues and non-tax revenues, but also creating an environment for external revenues to flow into the economies of the country. So we need to deepen our financial markets. We need to improve our public financial management practices and systems. And we also need to improve accountability systems to ensure that we don't have a lot of leakages. My brother, today we are seeing almost 90 billion US dollars flowing out of Africa on illicit financial flows. It is within the capacity of countries to put in regulations and rules and transparency and accountability systems to plug those holes. And that will help us to boost the revenue, the GDP side of that debt. And then we'll be able to finance more development with domestic revenue than financing everything with debt. But debt is fundamental and necessary aspect of growth. But it's about the quality of debt, what is borrowed for, what is used for, what are the terms of the debt, what are the durations of the debt, from where is it coming. All these are issues that can be addressed. And the African Development Bank Group has tools that has been developed to address that. And we're working with African countries to do that. Currently, on boosting domestic revenue, we're having a training starting on 13th of this month with all African countries, ministries of finance and debt management offices on how the tools that are available to make that happen. Now, but vaccination is also a major challenge. Yes, COVID is petering off in many parts of the world because the world has reached that average of about 60% of population fully vaccinated. But in Africa, it's still about 16%. In Nigeria, it's even worse because in Nigeria, it's still around 7%, if I recall the numbers correctly. So because of that, there are still high risk of a resurgence of COVID on the continent. And that's something that the whole world need to put an eye on, because whenever there's COVID anywhere, there is COVID everywhere. And then if we start seeing COVID again, then the lockdowns will start again, and all those containment measures will have similar impacts on poverty and GDP growth, as we have seen already. The impacts are so many. But before I stop on the ranking of the headwinds that we have, I've told you debt. I've told you the COVID issue. The other major issue is inflation. We're having significant inflationary pressures that has not been seen in recent times, and it's leaving finance ministers and central bank governors in a quagmire, because even the tools we have to address them can have knock-on effects on other things. If you try to contain inflation, you may raise the price of capital, and then the SMEs, who are the engines of growth, will suffer. And when that happens, GDP growth can be depressed. So there's a lot of balancing that needs to happen in order to try and ensure that those things are addressed going forward. And then the final thing is financing. Africa is having all these big headwinds. It's like having a tsunami after an earthquake and another tsunami or hurricane. But still, what we're seeing in all the indicators is that the financial flows into this continent is going down. Domestic revenue mobilization is going down. So despite the huge financial needs we have, we're not having that fiscal space to address it. So finding ways to boost financial flows, both domestic and external, is a central aspect of what this is calling for. And to give you just a typical example, because the report focused on climate change in terms of building climate resilience and just energy transitions, you'll find that to address the nationally determined contributions of this continent requires about 1.6 trillion US dollars. But currently, Africa is only receiving about 1.8 billion, about 18.3 billion annually in the past few years. So the financing gap is huge, up to 128 billion annually. So, and without that, we will not be able to address the impacts of climate change. We will not be able to address the COVID recovery, which requires over 432 billion US dollars between 2020 and 2023. So the lists are just ongoing. And so it's really scary to see that there's some form of a perverse relationship between the financing needs on Africa and the rates of financing that is coming into this continent. So finding ways to reverse that trend and improve financial flows into the continent is very central to sustained recovery.
All right. Well said. We just want to take a brief breaking news coming in here, Professor. Let's take a look at what's going on here. The All Progressive Congress, the ruling APC party, has apparently disqualified 10 presidential aspirants ahead of the party's primary scheduled to hold between June the 6th and June the 8th. So 10 of them didn't make the mark. The chairman of the Presidential Screening Committee and the former national chairman of the APC, Chief John Oyegun, disclosed this today in Abuja when it submitted its report to the party. The aspirants that were disqualified have not been made known yet. We will get those details to you as soon as they come in. So 10 of them have been disqualified. All right, Professor Urama, I want to ask you about the Purchasing Managers Index. How much weight do you place on them? You put that in the report for, I think, four nations. How much weight do you place on the PMI figures as far as gauging health for these economies on the African continent?
Yeah, thank you so much. The PMI is simply a diffusion index that tries to measure the economic activity that's going on in countries based on the companies that are surveyed. This is one of the most regular indicators that central banks and others do get. And as we have already said, we saw that is actually above the 50% mark in Africa, especially in the major economies, Egypt, Kenya, Nigeria, and also South Africa. So, and this is supported by the easing of the lockdowns in COVID, and also the policies that I've already mentioned that these countries have implemented to try and help recovery in the countries. So yes, we do put some weight on it, but like I have said, there are other uncertainties that we need to also consider as we try to look at the future for the continent. one of the major challenges, my brother, is that these days macroeconomic forecasting is now like looking at the crystal ball, because you are looking at issues based on the known challenges, but the unknown headwinds are now becoming more regular.
All right.
Like now, in the past 3 years, we've just had several, from COVID to climate change to Russia-Ukraine war to high inflation.
Yeah.
Nobody knows what's coming next.
Well, Professor Kevin Urama, acting chief economist at the African Development Bank, we really appreciate you joining us to talk about the outlook report for the continent. Joining us live from Abidjan. Thank you so much for your time.